what happened to classical music? For centuries, composers created music that sang with beautiful melody and harmony. Then suddenly, just over 100 years ago, a battle began for the very soul of music.
Early 20th century was an explosion of possibilities. The spirit of the day was to experiment, to seek out new sounds, moving really almost for the first time in musical history into the sphere of pure noise.
In concert halls across the world, radical new composers decided they'd had enough of the staple diet of Beethoven and Mozart.
There was a certain point in music where it was very mental.
Screechy music, pots and pans music. My cat could write that music.
Listening to it sometimes just makes my head want to explode.
As the century progressed, many composers experimented with the boundaries of sound. Their music became more and more confrontational, extreme, and challenging.
The rule book was torn up. I mean, let's make a noise that nobody likes. If the audience applauded your work, you'd failed as a composer.
I longed for the days of 19th century opera, where somebody would just stand up and start yelling, say, "Stop this madness."
But the 20th century was also one of the most extreme periods in history. Civil unrest, dictators, brutal wars, and the atom bomb. The rebels of modern music said they were simply reflecting the turmoil and madness of the world they lived in.
It was almost as if the history of music had been in black and white before. Music, like culture, like civilization in the West, cannot stand still. You have to destroy to grow.
This is the story of a revolution in sound, of how avant-garde composers broke from the melodic mainstream and catapulted classical music from beauty into beyond. One legendary evening in May 1906, the great and the good of the classical music world descended on the elegant Austrian city of Graz. They had traveled from far and wide to see an opera that had been banned by the court opera in Vienna. Its composer was an unlikely rebel, Richard Strauss, the 42-year-old German whose lush, romantic music had made him a star. But this was no ordinary opera. It was Salome, a musical adaptation of Oscar Wilde's scandalous play about Princess Judea's necrophiliac lust for John the Baptist. And it ushered in a century of musical scandals.
Strauss was conducting, Mahler was there. Schoenberg came with no fewer than 6 of his pupils. Puccini took the trip up from Italy to see what his operatic rival had come up with. And then there is this rumor that the teenage Adolf Hitler was present. Hitler himself, in fact, told Strauss's son that he was there. So it was very scandalous. I mean, Wilde had undergone his trial and imprisonment, and was his name was simply not spoken in many circles. It was somewhat daring, I think, of Strauss to make an opera on an Oscar Wilde text.
Even today, Salome is daring and shocking, a depraved trip into the underbelly of human emotion. But in 1906, it was beyond the pale. Its original leading lady, Mary Wittich, refused to perform its erotic dance or kiss John the Baptist's severed head because she was too respectable.
Strauss was giving us sadomasochism and the unconscious, showing that life is full of volcanic feelings and temperaments and so forth. And so you have really a bloodfest in Salome. You have the head of St. John the Baptist, and then you have Salome herself crushed to death at the end. People didn't like it. They found it painful, unharmonious, indecent.
But Strauss saved the biggest shock till the end. A short burst of unholy sound that has been called the most sickening chord in all opera. With just 8 notes of dissonance, Strauss captured the volcanic temperament of the new century and fired up a musical revolution.
It's still a thrilling and successful piece, and still a little unsettling. It is amazing to hear these sounds coming out of nowhere, out of Strauss's imagination, that simply no one had thought of before.
But the wind of change in classical music had been stirring since the end of the 19th century. In Paris, a city already enthralled to the sights, sounds, and possibilities of a new, modern world.
Paris then, in the 1880s, 1890s, in terms of literature and in terms of bubble of painting, but also of music, all the arts, was just bursting, as it seems, with imagination and genius.
There was a universal exposition in Paris in 1889 to mark the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution. And that's when the Eiffel Tower went up, and the very form and size of the Eiffel Tower is the kind of modernist symbol. And had this amazing 260-acre site in the center of Paris with 36 turnstiles admitting 1,000 people a minute. That's how vast it was.
Among the millions inspired by the exotic sights and sounds of the Paris Expo was the 27-year-old Claude Debussy, a composer with a mission to drive music into the 20th century.
Debussy is a unique figure. He probably is the start of what we call modern music. He was very ambitious. He said something along the lines of, I must invent a music that's worthy of the motor car and the era of the aeroplane and the Eiffel Tower.
Debussy went to the Paris exhibition in 1889, and he heard all sorts of music from all over the world, and he was just absolutely gobsmacked. None of this had been heard by Westerners before, and one of the key things he heard was the Javanese gamelan. The gamelan's an ensemble, an orchestra of gongs of all different sizes and metallophones and xylophones. And the sound itself is extremely sonorous. It's a completely different world. This had a cataclysmic effect on the sound that Debussy's music made.
In 1894, Debussy fused the sounds of the Eastern and Western worlds into a modern masterpiece, a unique sonic tapestry that threw open the doors to a century of musical innovation.
Prelude to the Afternoon of the Faun is considered perhaps the great radical piece of the late 19th century. It did not cause too great a scandal in its time, even if there was a camp who thought that Debussy had gone over the edge. But you are moving into a new world with the Afternoon of a Faun.
You could say that opening flute melody is the start of modern music. You have this sole lone instrument, a melody that's suspended in space. And there's an immediate sense of disorientation. And then the way in which the music proceeds in this free-flowing, organic sort of stream of consciousness almost is the opposite of the very directional classical music, Brahms, Beethoven. And when it was heard by that audience in the middle of the 1890s in Paris, it would not have been unstrange. It would have been very strange indeed.
Debussy argued that composers had a duty to evoke the progress of modern days. If classical music was to survive, it had to adapt to the dynamism and uproar of the modern world.
The early years of the 20th century were probably the greatest period of innovation in history. There's a whole raft of new discoveries. You have everything from the invention of flight, the invention of the cinema, relativity, Freud's theories of the unconscious. You've got all of these things coming within a generation. There's this feeling about that this really is a new age. And Ezra Pound said it clearly, make it new, make it new, make it new.
All over Europe, artists dismantled the old forms of their art, inventing radical new styles that perplexed and shocked. This was the birth of the century's most dramatic cultural revolution, the movement that became known as modernism.
Modernism turned the world round and saw it from different angles, but that is what each epoch has tended to do to music each century. Music changes, it develops, it alters. I mean, there are aspects of modernism which were extreme, very extreme, but tremendously exciting as well. And there was a very great and violent rejection of elements of the past.
Nowhere were the shockwaves more violently felt than in the city that was virtually a byword for classical music, Vienna. For 100 years, the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire had worshipped the giants of Romanticism: Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven. Sophisticated bourgeois audiences flocked to concerts of this exquisite melodic music. What chance then for a rebellious modern composer?
I try to put myself in the position of a composer during that time. You know, they may have felt much more bludgeoned by tradition than we understand. They may have wanted to go in just the opposite direction, which is what we as composers very often do. That's our only way to be original, is to do the opposite of what is a big deal.
Step forward Arnold Schoenberg, a formidable Austrian painter, inventor, and most significantly, composer, whose bloody-minded musical vision hit the refined world of Viennese concert halls like a wrecking ball. Music would never be the same again.
I am asking myself, would the music of the 20th century be changed if Schoenberg had not been born? And I say, yes, the life of music would have been totally changed if Schoenberg would not have existed.
Poor Schoenberg. You know, he carries the great weight of causing this terrible rot that happened in classical music. And I think Schoenberg especially is such a tragic figure, at least to me, because he started with such promise. You look at his early pieces, they're so beautiful. High romantic music. And then he found this other way.
Schoenberg was a loose cannon in the Viennese musical world. Largely self-taught, but brimming with confidence. He wanted nothing more than to overthrow the very rules of music itself. To be tuneless, rather than tuneful. The beautiful melodies of traditional Viennese music were rooted in consonance, complementary notes and chords that were harmonious to the ear. But Schoenberg embraced the opposite, dissonance. He used harsh, clashing patterns of notes that that were tonally at war with each other. His aim was to set music free. He spoke grandly of his emancipation of the dissonance.
When Schoenberg first emancipated the dissonance, first, moved away from the big tonal centers, the home keys of classical and romantic music. Every sense of anything that was resembling home seems to have been taken away.
Schoenberg was working to explode the parameters of harmony. And his harmony is a complex beast. It's a difficult thing to understand and engage with.
I find most of his music amazingly aurally ugly. I've never, ever been able to find a way into really loving it. I find it just sensually very, very punishing to my ear.
The sound world is this sort of angsty and very sort of brittle. You'd think by now that Schoenberg would be standard repertoire and nobody have a problem with it, but I think it's really interesting that quite a few of those pieces around that time are still difficult for 21st century audiences.
Difficult today, scandalous then. With his second string quartet, Schoenberg unveiled atonal music, a seemingly shapeless concoction of jarring sounds which tormented the audience into loud booing and provoked a critic to scream, "Stop it!" For the composer, it was visionary. For the listeners, it was cacophony.
There's a famous moment where a soprano sings is a Stefan George poem, Ich fühle Luft von anderen Planeten. I feel the air from other planets. And it's at that moment that Schoenberg's music, it is said, develops or goes into a kind of atonal sphere. But have a think about what the words are there. You know, it's a stroke of compositional imagination, absolutely not a kind of attempt to sort of shock people. It's actually about, you know, what's the best way of expressing what's happening in that poem? Air of other planets, non-gravitational music. Well, the most obvious thing to do, frankly, would be to write music that is unmoored, that isn't anchored to tonal center and doesn't give you that same sense of homecoming and going away from things that basically a lot of music before had been based on. When Schoenberg is finding these things, he's finding them because he has to express something at the absolute extremes of human emotion. It's music that's rendered absolutely as pure feeling.
He was a bit of an emotional wreck at the time. There was turmoil in his personal life. He discovered in the summer of 1908 that his wife was having an affair with an unstable expressionist painter named Richard Gerstel, who ended up committing suicide by hanging himself in his studio. And Schoenberg, he was Jewish in Vienna. And I think this was a factor as well in terms of his feeling of being watched from all sides and measured up. And as he went on, his situation as a Jew in that world became more and more important to him.
Schoenberg was fueled by rage and disgust. He saw Viennese society as sick, anti-Semitic, desperately clinging to the coattails of its decadent imperialist past. In an age of psychoanalysis and expressionist art, his music was forward-thinking. It was the audience that was backward. He stood tall in the face of rejection. "If I must commit artistic suicide," he announced, "I must live by it."
Schoenberg was aggressive. He was such a prickly individual. There was a powerful, and in some cases dark, emotion at work in this music, which was the music of Vienna at the time, where so many artists and writers were playing with these very dark and extreme emotions. If you think of these harsh and angular images of Kokoschka and Egon Schiele, it was the style of that time in Vienna to confront the audience, to show them things that they didn't want to see, to expose the underside of human life, to go to the dark side.
Oh, there was definitely something in the air. I mean, whether with the benefit of hindsight, we can see the kind of collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the kind of degeneration of that environment. The thing that Schoenberg did, of course, was to take those moments of crisis to another level. And it's through that kind of crisis that he actually steps into this abyss, as it's called, the abyss of no tonal center, which is what the audiences at the time found disturbing and difficult.
But Schoenberg's music of crisis didn't just upset their ears. By seemingly rejecting 2 centuries worth of music tradition, audiences felt his work was a slap in the face to their culture of beauty and refinement.
There are musical reasons for these cataclysmic audience reactions, but there are also social reasons. The growing bourgeoisie in the cities across Europe. They expected music to behave like they wanted. They cared desperately about this music. And to hear these weird sounds where the rules of harmony break down seemed like an attack not only on their artistic world, but on themselves, on their universe, in fact, on their society.
My father was not discrediting, and he said that over and over again. He was not discrediting the past. He was saying, I am living in a certain period, and I'm going to evolve from what was proper in another period. In a lot of other disciplines, people do want to be modern, and they do want to have change. And it seems like in music, people would rather stay with the old.
It was only a few years earlier that Debussy and Strauss had paved the way for Schoenberg's radical reinvention of music's language. If the public couldn't get to grips with it, surely at least his fellow composers could.
I think Schoenberg thought that of all people, Richard Strauss, the composer of Salome and Elektra, would understand what he was trying to do. But Strauss did not at all comprehend what Schoenberg was trying to do, and thought that he had gone off the deep end, as so many other people were saying at that time. And there was really then a serious falling out between them when Schoenberg discovered that Strauss had written a letter saying that Schoenberg would be better off shoveling snow than writing on music paper. And so that was the end of that, really.
Down, but not out. Atonality continued its forward march, for Schoenberg had partners in crime. 2 of his former pupils, Alban Berg and Anton Webern, had become converts to the emancipation of the dissonance. When quizzed about their music's absence of tonality, Webern snapped, "We broke its neck."
Oh, Webern is a strange animal. He was a strange, lonely, quiet, melancholy man, very, very sensitive, nervous as well. And he evolved through the encouragement and through, above all, the technical expertise that Schoenberg gave him, one of the most amazingly individual and poetic styles of music that we've ever had in Western music.
Webern's breakthrough works were the polar opposite of grand 19th century symphonies. They were brief and fragmented. He arranged musical notes as if they were brushstrokes on an abstract painting. Schoenberg himself described them as a novel contained within a single sigh.
Webern's music just moves. It behaves in a completely different way. So it's more like looking at a crystal under the microscope, or thinking about the way that plants form and develop. And it's able, I think, to do strange things with space and time.
You feel that time moves in a special way, and you feel yourself hovering, almost weightless. His music is so deprived of most of the sensual pleasures of music. It doesn't have great energy. It doesn't have a massive sound. He had a sort of fanatical belief in the structures that he was creating, as if they had some sort of deep, universal, mystical truth about them.
I like Webern, but I also find it extraordinarily emotionally stingy. Webern fit a certain kind of sensibility of the time, which was that he was very tightly wired. His organization of all the elements of the music was something that gave particular kinds of anal retentives just, a frisson of pleasure. No element in the music was spontaneously generated or intuitive. It's this scientific imposition onto an artistic activity.
With their unfathomable music receiving few performances, atonal composers were forced to conduct and to teach to make a living. But they were undaunted. They saw themselves making a quantum leap in music, the equivalent of Einstein's discoveries in physics. And just as few people could figure out E = mc squared, so atonality was unashamedly complex. If it is art, Schoenberg said, it is not for all. And if it is for all, it is not art.
Modernism was, and maybe still is, elitist. Composers felt that only people that were educated or had some sort of genius or talent could really appreciate what was being said.
The rise of scientific thinking and critical thinking changed everything. In classical music, it became so intellectual that it couldn't be enjoyed, or that it wasn't allowed to be enjoyed by a common audience member. His argument was, I'm working at this level, and it's up to you to have the education and the experience to come and understand it. I'm at the mountaintop, you come to me.
But not all modernist composers were quite so lofty and alienating. While Viennese audiences scratched their heads at atonality, Parisians were wowed by the inventions of a gregarious Russian émigré who became arguably the most popular modernist of all, Igor Stravinsky.
Well, for me, it's just an open and shut case that if you say, who's the greatest composer of the 20th century, it's Igor Stravinsky. And, is there any further discussion? I don't have any further discussion.
Although I love Schoenberg and Berg and Webern, I mean, the Stravinsky is my god.
I first saw Stravinsky conduct when I was 11 years old, and I later played under his direction, and he had such a sparkle and such a curiosity, a delight. It was so clear how much he enjoyed composing.
The interest of my life, my everyday life, is to make.
Stravinsky, a former law student who arrived in Paris in 1910, was not without his own share of controversy. In 1913, at Paris's Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, his score for a controversial new ballet sparked the most legendary riot in all 20th century music. An orchestral force of nature, The Rite of Spring was a musical jolt that packed a mighty punch.
I was about 13 years old when I heard The Rite of Spring for the first time. It was like opening the door to a world that I never conceived of before. I mean, it was just so powerful. Talk about visceral with a capital V. I mean, it was just completely overwhelming.
Every time you hear The Rite of Spring today, you're always taken by surprise. You have this rhythm coming at you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's like a boxer coming at you from all angles, and you never know where the next blow is going to land. And that particular section, and this is where the big riot broke out in the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées in 1913.
It was full of very noisy public and very hostile public. And so I went out when I heard all this noise. I said, go to hell. Excuse me, Monsieur et Dame, and goodbye.
The Rite of Spring collapsed the rules of rhythm, making it jarring and unpredictable, just like Schoenberg had done with melody. Yet Schoenberg felt Stravinsky was merely dipping his toe into the troubled water of modernism, still holding on to old modes of harmony and tonality. He nicknamed his great rival the Little Modernsky.
Stravinsky had a very different attitude to melody and to harmony from Schoenberg. He was much more about taking what we know and fragmenting it in an almost cubist type way. You get one very familiar harmony and another very familiar harmony, and they're juxtaposed together so that they sound really crunchy and dissonant. It's a bit like Picasso sort of cutting up an image of a violin. It's something very familiar, but it's fractured and fragmented.
Stravinsky placed himself at the heart of the 20th century revolution in European culture. He'd gone to Paris to escape the imperial music of his native Russia, dominated by the rousing nationalism of his teacher, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov. Yet, ironically, his radical compositions were unthinkable without the old tunes of his homeland.
You have these dissonances in Stravinsky, in The Rite of Spring, and even before in Firebird and Petrushka. But they come from a completely different source. They come, to a great extent, from folk music. Stravinsky is delving into folk music, Eastern Europe, Russia, the sounds of the rural population, trying to listen more closely than others had done before. And to try to think about, well, how can I really capture what it's like to see people sort of dancing in the street of a village? What would that sound like, and how can I make it different from the conventional music of the present?
In Russia, reception of Stravinsky's music was difficult. But there was great suspicion about the kind of nationalism that Stravinsky created. For example, Rimsky-Korsakov's son, Andrei Rimsky-Korsakov, stopped speaking to Stravinsky after Petrushka because he felt that this folk material was distorted. It was presented in an ironic way, and it was like he was making fun of all these tunes, and that was not the good way of his father, Rimsky-Korsakov, who glorified these tunes. And Stravinsky didn't do that. Yeah, he sort of cut them up, sliced them up, and served it as a completely different sort of modernist dish.
Early Stravinsky is an extreme nationalistic composer, and this was another aspect of modernism. This idea of people strongly departing from the Austro-German Empire's musical language and writing with the help of indigenous music and folk tunes above all, a type of music which reflects their society, their civilization on the world stage.
In the capitals of early 20th century Europe, modernism had transformed classical music. It would soon rear its head thousands of miles away in the New World, America. At the turn of the century, America was a nation in transition. Only 40 years since a civil war, but on the brink of becoming the most powerful country in the world. Its music, too, was poised between the comfort of the old and the shock of the new.
American culture was a very conservative atmosphere. There were these wonderful orchestras and opera houses, but the repertoire was heavily European. There wasn't a sense yet of a new, absolutely American sound, or even an individual sound. I mean, there are very few composers that you could identify as really having a very strong personality.
There's a time in many a life when it's due to face death, but I don't give away.
Enter a maverick New Englander, lauded as the Pilgrim Father of modern American music, Charles Ives.
Hip hip hooray, you'll hear them say as they go to the fight and run.
Charles Ives trained in music at Yale right at the turn of the century, and then he dropped out. He disappeared from the music world, at least. He went into life insurance and became a very successful life insurance executive. Made a great deal of money for himself and for his company. He was a master of the hard sell. He would show door-to-door salespeople how to relentlessly get the product across so that people can resist in a way. And in music, he was the complete opposite. He continued composing, but in almost total privacy, isolation. It was a long time before a lot of pieces by Ives were even played.
For me, Ives is America's most important modernist composer. And it's no accident that so many of these composers, Stravinsky, Ives, are so heavily based on vernacular music. It's village music, it's folk music, but it's abstracted and taken to remarkably visionary places.
It's almost a photo album, a sonic photo album, because you're literally hearing the sounds of America at the time that he was alive. He's taking the sounds of marching bands, of quartets that he'd heard, church hymnals, sounds of his life, and integrating them into the music, sometimes layered over the top of each other. It's evocative of America first because it is America.
Ives took the humble, homespun tunes of his childhood, chopped them up like Stravinsky, then collapsed them into a discordant jigsaw of sound as jarring and radical as Schoenberg. But his music didn't challenge or disturb his audience, because he didn't have one. He was a lone modernist voice in an old world country.
America was a very raw, young country, and Charles Ives simply arrived at a too early time in our country's development. And I think he also felt strangely bifurcated. You know, he felt he had to be a businessman and a good American, a good Protestant ethic kind of guy. And then he had this other side, which was his creative side. And you know, in New York City and Connecticut in 1890, you were a dandy if you liked classical music. It wasn't manly, you know, it wasn't something the guys did. So I think that caused a great kind of internal dissonance for Ives.
Dissonance and consonance. In music, Ives favoured neither one nor the other. He loved the Sturm und Drang of atonality, but he also loved traditional melodies. When he finally made his music available to fellow musicians in 1920, it was with a piano sonata that encompassed both.
The Concord Sonata was probably his most familiar masterpiece and also one of his most radical works. In the opening movement in Emerson, you have the impression of just some kind of titanic force coming at you. It gives this impression of massiveness, of sort of imperturbable nature, and all the violence of nature as well. Then there's this remarkable third movement, which is very different in tone. The Alcotts, a domestic scene of people playing music and singing. And you hear little bits of Beethoven sort of coming in and out. The so-called fate motif of Beethoven's Fifth keeps recurring. It's a piece about music, about listening in a lot of ways. That Alcotts movement, it's extremely touching.
The thing about Ives now is it doesn't matter when he wrote these things. It only matters what his music says, and what his music says is mostly sad and beautiful things. The music is about a world of America that he sees slipping away. It's not even his world, it's his father's world. It's the way people felt in those little towns after the Civil War, the idealism they had, the neighborliness, the closeness, the way the little tunes were drifting from the blacksmith shop into the parlor and the church organ, all that. that closeness was gone, and Ives' music has this meditative farewell, leave-taking to all of that, and sometimes a kind of rage. Why has this happened?
What had happened? America had become the most advanced nation in the modern world. In just over 100 years, its population had gone from 6 million to 106 million. Ives' radical sound was ahead of its time, but now the European avant-garde was making an impact in the USA, where the music of chaos fit its cityscapes of speed and noise.
If you look at a cross-section of any year of what composers are doing in the 20th century, you will find every sort of human reaction to the events that are happening in the world. So you will find composers who stick their head in the sand, to lament the loss of a lost culture. And you will find composers who say, we need to find not just a completely new way of writing music, but a completely different world order. We need to reflect the sound, the noise, the fury of the world arouses, whether it's the sound of the popular cultures that people are hearing, or whether it's the sounds of machinery.
I suppose the composer who grabbed the machine age most enthusiastically was Edgar Varèse. He was originally French, and then towards the end of the First World War, he went to live in New York. He arrived in New York as the first skyscrapers were going up. And immediately, he absolutely grabbed the sights and the sounds of the machine age, and all of that went into his music.
Varèse said he wanted to find a bomb that would make the musical world explode. In 1922, with the gargantuan orchestral piece Amérique, he dragged the sounds of the city into the sedate world of the concert hall.
Amérique. It's got so much in common with Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. It has those thrashing, off-kilter rhythms of the Rite of Spring. But whereas the Rite of Spring is a sort of pagan ritual, Amérique is a hymn to the modern age, a hymn to the machine age. So you hear the sound of a dredger on the Hudson River. You hear the sound of the overhead railway that went past his apartment. You hear sirens. He was trying to imagine a music of the future.
He saw this great city of noise, of din, of chaos. And it remains one of the great evocations of the city, and really one of the wildest pieces ever created.
Wild, but also a sensation. When Amérique made its explosive New York debut at Carnegie Hall in 1926, it was a surprise hit with audience and critics alike. Somehow, Varèse had managed to capture the zeitgeist of his adopted country. Deafening, determined, and dynamic.
There was something about the spirit of America and New York especially in the first part of the 20th century that was really anything goes. There was this spirit of optimism in that moment, and right in that time, jazz began to emerge, and that changed everything.
In the Roaring '20s, America's cities were buzzing with new sounds on every corner. A huge immigrant population had seized the promise of the good life in the new world. They brought with them a melting pot of musical styles, and jazz took over as the hot new sound. For the first time in history, popular music rivaled art music for invention and modernity.
What did happen that was very unique in the 20th century was at a certain point, art actually entered the province of the popular. So you have people like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, George Gershwin, who actually reached hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of people with something that they considered popular, but they did have the substance of fine art.
The son of Jewish immigrants from the Ukraine, George Gershwin was, by the age of just 20, one of the most successful songwriters on Broadway. But he was also a classically trained composer who strove to write symphonic pieces that would be taken seriously in America's concert halls. As with so many modernists, his orchestral music drew on traditional folk styles, the sounds of his own Jewish heritage, and equally the church spirituals and jazz sound of the black population. But his ear for a great melody was always front and center.
Gershwin was this wonderfully ambiguous figure between classical music and popular music. The Rhapsody in Blue was premiered at a concert called An Experiment in Modern Music, and it was another great spectacle of the period, much talked about, much written about, somewhat controversial because people thought, well, these worlds shouldn't mix necessarily. We should have classical in its one world and jazz in the other. You shouldn't try to combine them together. You end up falling between two stools. And yet he pulled it off.
He realized that there was something that was going on with the black people, that everybody that was humanly available and could touch everybody. He went to the churches. He sang with the people. He also went to Harlem. And see, that Rhapsody in Blue actually is his musical pay-in to Harlem, to stride piano, Negro melodies and rhythms, to all of those things that he heard. So he basically was saying, look, this is what all of us need to be building on. Music communicates human experience. That's the power of it.
Rhapsody in Blue was a resounding success, totally eclipsing in popularity the experimental modernism of his European colleagues. But it symbolized the great schism that hung over much early 20th century music. If Gershwin's tunes spoke to millions, did that make him a less serious composer?
It wasn't that long ago that popular music was a good thing. And in fact, composers tried to be popular. Or at the very least, they tried to write music that people would like to listen to. But something happened in the 20th century where, critically especially, artists began to be frowned upon for the popularity of their work. And isn't that odd? It should be the exact opposite. I'm amazed now, even these days, that Rhapsody in Blue or An American in Paris, for instance, be odd almost to see it performed on a serious concert. And in fact, the audiences, they desperately want to hear it. They love it. I love it. Why not have it on there? Why not let audiences enjoy that as well as the tough stuff?
Gershwin himself was torn between the popular and the tough stuff. He traveled to Europe in 1928, to seek out the titans of European modernism. For he felt that to become a serious composer, he should adopt their hardcore revolutionary styles.
Gershwin went to Stravinsky and to my father and wanted to study with them. And each of them refused to teach him. And the story goes that he asked Stravinsky to teach him, and Stravinsky said, "How much do you earn?" And Gershwin told him how many millions he was making. And so Stravinsky said, "Well, then I should study with you." So that's Stravinsky. And then he came to my father, and he said, "I would like to study with you." And my father said, "No, I will not accept you, because right now you are a great Gershwin, and if you studied with me, you would be a mediocre Schoenberg."
And yet, by the early 1930s, the great Broadway tunesmith and the father of atonality had hit it off. Their rivalry confined only to the tennis court, because by then Schoenberg was, somewhat ironically, living in the very heart of popular entertainment, Los Angeles, California. He'd fled from a Europe where the radical experiments of modernist Jewish composers were facing a much more terrifying enemy than unwelcoming bourgeois audiences. In Vienna, crowds of Austrian Nazis were taking to the streets. They were campaigning to forge a union between Austria and Germany. Schoenberg had been teaching in Berlin. He saw at first hand the looming, inexorable rise of the Third Reich.
My father was aware of the political situation in Germany. He knew Hitler was coming to power, and he expected things to go really badly. He had already written, "How can this end? It can only end in destruction and the killing of Jews," and things like this. So he was really very much aware and way ahead of his time in understanding what a terrible situation this would come to.
Schoenberg foresaw that his music would die under the Nazis, basically, and saw the catastrophe that was looming. Other great composers didn't have the same moral compass and were slightly more confused by what must have been an appalling epoch to live through, and it's very easy to judge today. But there are writings in the early 40s of Webern which praise Hitler in an embarrassing and terrible way. One has to either forgive or forget a naive and confused composer during a very difficult time. Modern composers did have a thorny relationship with the general public, and they thought that totalitarian leaders in Italy as well would give funds and support for this art form in a way that a more democratic civilization wouldn't. And so at first, at least, they had high hopes for fascism, sadly.
"I see such a good future," Webern wrote of Hitler's rise. He couldn't have been more wrong. The world was about to be plunged into war, and music's modernist progress would be derailed by totalitarianism. In the next program, as the Second World War raged, the world of classical music suffered from repression and censorship. But when peace was restored, composers responded by taking music to the extremes of violence and noise. To find out more about 20th century composers and for details of a year-long festival of events celebrating a century of revolution in music, art and culture, go to bbc.co.uk/Sound and the Fury and follow the links to the Open University.